Welcome everybody to History Matters. This is our last History Matter. Well, no, it's the second to last. That's actually this is second to last History Matters for this semester. So we're very excited to be here. Before we get started, a couple of points of business. There's a sign up sheet coming around. Please make sure you sign in for whatever reason you're signing in. So we have it. And some announcements. If you have not had enough of the history, philosophy, politics, and economics part today, for this period, you can come back at 3:30 for philosophy matters at CLO 140. Just hear Professor Sam Zanayish talk on how to get away with bad behavior by using an excuse. That presentation is also Zoomed. We will have one more, as I said, of History Matters this semester. I believe it's some independent study students presenting their work, so just stay tuned for that. Next semester, we will begin again in February with Professor George Elliott's presentation on early American alchemy of Dorothy Treat. I know, it's very exciting. And if you're interested in that, you can take his class next spring, Heretics and Healers, the History of Medicine, as on Mondays and Wednesdays at 12:30. And then in March, we will have a History Matters from Professor Kathy Tobin, looking at women's activism and the nuclear test ban treaty. And this talk will be part of PNW's celebration of Women's History Month. I know, stay tuned for those dates. And our Philosophy Matters will return in the spring with Professor Deepa Majumdar in February and Professor Hun Lee in April. And I know his talk is going to be on anime and philosophy. So pay attention to those. But today we are lucky to have Professor James Hysell talk to us, his continuing lecture of history. Professor Hysell's work, his research is primarily focused on gender and violence in Victorian Britain. Recently, he has worked on the novel by Jack the Ripper, and if you tune into the HPP YouTube, you can hear that, so you can see that presentation. Yeah, and she's looked at how punk culture and its continued persistence globally. It's very exciting. So if you're interested in taking a class with Professor Hysell, he focuses on Europe and Asia, from the ancient to modern worlds, as well as research and writing, of course, offered for your history majors up there. This spring, Professor Hysell will be offering History 110, the pre-modern world, and several sections of Intro to Asia and Intro to Medieval. Right. Today's Professor Hysell's talk is Punk AF. For those of you we welcome those of you, Westville, hi guys. And those of you who are on Zoom, welcome. We'll field questions in the chat. But I'd ask you to, for those of you on Zoom, to mute your mics until that's that time, okay?
Good afternoon. So punk is an amorphous concept. It's something that people argue about constantly. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm expecting people to take issue with what I say about it today, because if they didn't, that really wouldn't be very punk at all. And the reality is that the term itself is significantly older than what we associate with it. Its first, well, one of its first appearances is in Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. It's Act 5, Scene 1, and it's actually talking about a prostitute. So it's a term that hasn't always had a very positive connotation, but it is one that the scene and the subculture has chosen for itself. And a lot of that's because punk is an accident. It's not something that was meant to happen. It wasn't set out for. It's something that developed naturally. And it developed at this unprepossessing club in the Bowery of New York, CBGB OMFUG, and the OMFUG is part of its name. You see, what happened was there was a man named Billy Crystal who wanted to revitalize the live music scene in New York, and his goal was for a country and bluegrass bar. That's what he wanted. So he buys this place, or he rents it, I should say, because he is notoriously behind on his rent, and sets it up. But the problem is he doesn't get any country or bluegrass groups to come perform, because he has a very specific proviso for all of the bands that perform for him. They have to make original music. They can't be doing covers of other people's work. So the only bands he's getting are groups of weirdos, really, who are wandering the Bowery and trying to make a name for themselves as musicians. So that's when he added the OMFUG, because it does stand for country, bluegrass, and blues, but it also stands for other music for upstanding gormandizers. I'm not exactly sure what gormandizer means, but the thing is that he's putting that out there. Now, among the bands that start out here, the one that is probably most obviously punk are the Ramones. There are a number of other bands, Blondie, Patti Smith. You also get Television, Richard Hell and the Voidoids. They all start this live scene. And the reality is that punk doesn't actually come just one musical genre at this point. This is a group of bands getting together and being publicized by a magazine called Punk. The man behind the name, his name was Lex McNeil. And he says they came up with the name to take away the pejorative term that was associated with punk. He would see it on murder mysteries of the era, kids being called punks constantly. And he said, what could be the most offensive thing that I take away? And he uses punk as the way to do this. So he starts interviewing these bands that are in these, that are playing at CBGBs. And the Ramones are arguably the most notable of these first bands, primarily because musically, punk rock takes the most from them. They are dissatisfied with the way that the music of their era has developed. They were fans of the 1950s and 1960s of a more stripped down rock sound. And the 1970s had brought what they viewed as overly verbose and self-indulgent music. That is not what they wanted. So they start to make their own, and they actually think they're going to be popular. They really do. They think they're going to be popular, that they're going to be the mainstream of music. And the reality is that they just were not capable of making mainstream music. It wasn't in their DNA. A quote from Tommy Ramone, August 12th of 1976 is, "Our music is an answer to the early 70s when artsy people with big egos would do vocal harmonies and play long guitar solos and get called geniuses. That was bullshit. We play rock and roll. That's it. That's the core of it. That's who they are." They did almost exclusively downstrokes on the guitar. They thought that upstrokes were pretentious, which I find deeply amusing and really indicative of the band in general. Now, while the Ramones are usually classified as the first of the punk bands, the one that usually gets a lot of press and a lot of ideas that are attached to it are the Sex Pistols. Now, the Sex Pistols are manufactured. They don't come together naturally the way that the Ramones did. They're not even the first of the British punk bands. That one goes to the Damned. The Damned put out an album before the Sex Pistols. They played a show before the Sex Pistols, but the Sex Pistols had good marketing. And they were put together by managing Malcolm McLaren, and they teamed with a stylist, of all things. The Sex Pistols were about style, and there's not a lot of substance attached to it. Now, do they say things with their music? Yeah, occasionally. But the reality is that they were there to shock and to terrify. The British press at the time viewed them as the end of Western civilization, that they are tearing down these institutions, these ideas and these concepts. And members like Johnny Rotten or John Lydon, if you prefer to use his real name, really played this up. They would go on television, they would say the most shocking things that they could to get a lot of attention. And unfortunately, this creates a mentality within a lot of the British music press that punk is something that is manufactured. During the 25th anniversary special, you have a guy who's on there arguing with members of the Clash, members of the Damned, that their music was manufactured, and his only evidence is the Sex Pistols. So in a lot of ways, the Sex Pistols, while they do make punk famous, particularly with songs like Anarchy in the UK, as well as God Save the Queen, they are the first band to ever reach #1 on the UK charts and have both their name and the name of their song blacked out. So when you would look at the charts, it's just black line, black line. That's the Sex Pistols. But really, it's the Clash out of the early punk bands from Britain who are the most important in terms of musical style and in terms of ethos and identity. So the Clash have political movements. They have ideas, they have things that they want to communicate. And of the British bands, and honestly of the first wave of punk bands, they're the first ones to do this. The Ramones are concerned with things that they either want or don't want. If you look at the titles of their songs, it's I don't wanna, I don't wanna, I wanna, right? Notably, I wanna sniff some glue. They thought they were gonna be pop stars. I don't know how they thought that song was going to do it for them, but that's who they were. The Clash are writing about issues with urban society. They're writing about issues with class and class structure in Britain. They are the ones who are really beginning to create a political consciousness for punk. And we do see that with their self-titled album. One that actually had to be changed for a US audience. They removed the song, I'm So Bored with the USA. And they replaced it with a cover of I Fought the Law. Which is really interesting because what you're doing is you're taking a song that's talking about American imperialism and its presence in the market, and you're replacing it with a song about the futility of fighting against legal structures. I mean, it says quite a bit. So the Clash are this first really political band. And what's really interesting is that they latch on to a lot of different musical styles and identities. In particular, they latch on to ska from Jamaica. They also attach themselves to various forms of rocksteady and reggae. And they experiment more musically than almost any of the other early bands. Now, a quote about these early punks that I find really interesting is, with the punks, I saw these kids just thumbing their nose at the music business. They were just going, we don't give a shit what you guys think. We're going to sing our songs our own way. And I thought, how liberating. And I vowed that if my band ever broke up, that's what I was going to do. Go back to Marion County and surround myself with my favorite R&B bass guys, and we'll just play at our local pub and we'll see where the chips fall. And that's exactly what we did. That's Huey Lewis from Huey Lewis and the News. If you don't know who that is, he sings The Power of Love on Back to the Future. He's not a punk. He's not playing punk in any way, shape, or form, but he is inspired by this attitude that they are going to make the music they want to make. And a lot of people see that as liberation, that they don't have to be bound by these ideas and concepts. Now, after the Clash, we have Crass. This is punk changing dramatically. You see, the early punk bands had some commercial success. They had some commercial viability. But that idea, that concept can't last. Popularity is fleeting, trends are fleeting, and Crass is an example of this. They never set out to be famous. They set out to make the music they wanted to. They're anarchists at their core. They wanted to offend. They wanted to write highly socialist, highly anarchic songs, and they did. They lived in a collective squat, meaning they literally just found a house, lived in it together, and they cycle in members so that no one's ever not there, so they can keep the house. And they write things that people find highly offensive. Good example is on their album, The Feeding of the 5,000, which is an attack on organized religion. In fact, one of the things that they are very upset about organized religion when, in general, is they look at events in world history like the Holocaust, and they think that if God was really all powerful and perfectly good, and if Jesus was a part of that, they would have never allowed it to happen. So for them, the failure of divine intervention to stop something like the Holocaust is the failure of religion. And they manifest this in their lyrics. So on The Feeding of the 5,000, their first song is called The Silent. And it is a castigation of organized Christianity. And the thing is that that album went for pressing in Ireland, which was a highly Catholic state at the time. And the workers in the pressing factory would not press the album for them. So they added a silent track to the album and titled it The Sound of Freedom of Speech. And then repressed the album later with a silent attached to it. I will tell you, if you ever want to feel slightly disturbed, listen to Hysell. It is not an easy listen in any way, shape, or form. But Crass demonstrate that punk doesn't need the charts. it doesn't need to be popular. And they also get in trouble legally as well. They splice together a tape using razor blades and tape, literally razor blades and tape, to have Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan sound like they are discussing the nuclear annihilation of the world. And they get investigated by MI6 and the CIA because of this. It's obviously fake. They didn't do it. But they terrified the powers that be enough that they sent these institutional forces to investigate these punks. Moving on to more underground punk and its movement out of the mainstream. The reality is that punk was never going to be able to maintain its position as an anti-authority, anti-establishment musical genre if it was popular. Because who controls popular music? The establishment and authority. And with the decline in popularity of punk, you have the emergence of the first bands who are populated by actual punks. Now, those first punk bands, they're the proto-punks. They're coming up with the ideas and concepts. They're not punks yet. They're making the music. These guys are the ones who are becoming the punks. They're the ones who are making the subculture and describing it and articulating it. So Black Flag, Bad Brains, Dead Kennedys. These bands are good examples of groups of punks coming together, realizing that the music they want to make is not being made, and instead of complaining about it, they make it for themselves. Black Flag in particular is active in LA during the early 80s, and they come into conflict with the LAPD. Going into 1984, LA was getting ready for the Olympics, and they wanted to clean up the streets of LA to make it presentable to the world, and the punks became targets of it. One of the things that comes out is that the LAPD had dossiers on prominent punks, not just the bands, but the fans of these bands. Now, granted, there was a lot of violence associated with the LA punk and hardcore scene at the time. We call these bands hardcore because they are playing harder and faster than your traditional punk bands. Black Flag in particular can get quite sludgy, I think would be the best way to put it. And very challenging for people. But the violence starts to break out. This actually starts to really push a lot of bands away. The LAPD starts to shut down concerts almost as soon as they start. And over 21 clubs are the only ones who are really able to show these bands, and the band's fan bases are under 21 for the most part. So what happens is you see a move out of venues into basement clubs, playing in people's garages, playing in people's basements, damaging their walls, things of that nature. So Black Flag, one of those bands. This is something that comes out of the DC hardcore band Minor Threat. So Minor Threat is very famous in the punk scene, in particular for articulating an ideology called straight edge. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, this is punk rebelling against itself in a lot of ways. There were a lot of excesses in terms of drugs and alcohol in that early punk scene. Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols notably murders his girlfriend and himself in a drug-fueled rage. And straight edge is about not consuming alcohol, not doing drugs, not engaging in destructive behaviors. And they start to kind of form this identity around straight edge. Now, the band itself doesn't want to start a movement, but that's the way movements start. You present an idea, people attach to it. And they really champion playing in under 21 clubs. Notably, under 21 fans would have to put black X's on their hands so they wouldn't be served drinks. This becomes a symbol of the straight edge movement from here on out. This is in reference to Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, Edwin Meese, who was engaged in, let's just say, a number of controversies and scandals as Attorney General. And the drummer of Minor Threat created this sign that tied it to a t-shirt that said, "Critics agree, Meese is a pig." And these start popping up around DC. And if you go back and look at newspaper articles from the time, no one can figure out where they're coming from. No one understands what's happening. But a bike messenger wears this as a shirt into the State Department to deliver mail, and he's refused entry. And it actually becomes an ACLU case because of his freedom of speech being violated by this. In fact, the uproar over it gets the State Department to back down and to allow people to wear the shirt inside of it. So punk is moving in directions. It is becoming very opinionated and very active. These are the Dead Kennedys. This is a Bay Area band, so they're from the San Francisco Bay Area, and they are highly political. Jello Biafra, the lead singer with the driver's lights on, look at his face right there, runs for mayor of San Francisco and also teases running for governor a number of times. They are openly antagonistic of power structures and authority, and notably put this in their album Frankenchrist. It's an H.R. Giger art print, which if you look at it long enough, you begin to see there are parts of the image which may not be deemed as socially acceptable. And this brings them to the attention of the PMRC. This is a group that wants to clean up the music industry. They are the ones who get the parental advisory stickers placed onto their albums. And the Dead Kennedys go after them. They attack the PMRC. Punk in general attacks the PMRC quite directly. Also in the 80s, the band NoFX puts out a song called The PMRC Can Suck on This. It's not a polite song, to say the least. But the Dead Kennedys actually do a bit of a press run. Jello Biafra actually goes on an episode of Oprah to discuss the Dead Kennedys and their ideas. He wears a suit, which is honestly one of the most odd things I've seen in my entire life. It's Jello Biafra sitting on stage talking to Oprah in a suit and watching her not give him a chance at all. You can find this on YouTube if you look up Jello Biafra on Oprah, and you will see him defending very eloquently the Dead Kennedys and what they are talking about, what they are doing, and the general public being ardently opposed to them in general. We also see punk manifesting in political activism. This is Doc Dark. He is a member of the band called The Crucifix. And he wants to set up a rape clinic in Lansing, Michigan. That's all he wants. And none of the political candidates running for office in Lansing are willing to commit to creating a rape clinic in Lansing. So Doc Dark runs for mayor. He doesn't want to win, but what he does is he siphons off enough votes that he's able to essentially offer those votes to the closest winner in exchange for setting up the rape clinic. And he gets it. He succeeds in his activities. So we can see that punk isn't just about complaining about things. It's active engagement. It is actively moving the political spectrum, not because they are successful, but because they're making people talk about issues. And they're able to siphon off enough support that they can force the issue. Now, a number of bands during this period start to emerge. You get what's known as the youth crew movement in New York, with bands like Gorilla Biscuits and the Youth of Today, forwarding more straight edge ideology. But punk music in general seems to be on the decline. And as its popularity goes on the decline, there is this worry that punk will die. There's always these thoughts that punk is dead. It's going to die. It's not going to be there anymore. But the reality is that if you have enough disenfranchised or disaffected youth, it's going to survive. And what happens is that in 1986, one of the punk bands that had been part of the LA scene, that had been kind of inactive for a while, get back together and they put out an album called Suffolk. And the interesting thing about this, if you ever watch any documentaries on punk in the 80s, it talks about the scene almost dying. And it says, and then you hear the opening guitar line of the song Suffolk. Bad Religion comes out, and they make a much less aggressive form of punk than the Black Flags and the other hardcore bands of the era, but one that is, in a lot of ways, more intelligent. One of the things that is notable about Bad Religion is their usage of fairly dense vocabulary. In one song, when criticizing the academic elite, they say that graduated mentors, stolen marble brick porticos, in sagacious dialogue, they despise their average ways. This isn't a punk song with a standard 3-chord progression. The music's not what's important. The message is what's important. And that's what we begin to see with these bands. So, In places like East Germany and Europe, punk is seen as a direct challenge or a direct assault on the power structure. In fact, one of the problems that East Germany in particular has is that the ideal is that the socialist state has removed any want or need within East Germany. And the punks represent that this isn't true. And we have a number of bands getting smuggled across the Berlin Wall to play shows in East Germany, and a number of punk bands emerging in East Germany. And we actually have Stasi files on it. This is actually a photo of a concert being given in East Germany illegally, and then photos of arrest records of punks operating in East Germany that the Stasi, or the secret police of East Germany, maintained in government records. In fact, we see a lot of graffiti in East Germany at the time that roughly translated comes out to legal, illegal, don't give a fuck. It rhymes in German. But the idea is that the creation of the state in East Germany that was supposed to take away all these problems didn't do it. And the punks are going to tell you when you don't live up to your standards, when you don't live up to your promises. Their goal in life is to make sure that you are never comfortable. The things that you want to see achieved, if you don't achieve them or work towards them, they will go after you. In 1988, in the city of New York, there's the Tompkins Square riot. This centers around a park on the Lower East Side of New York. And what happened was that Mayor Koch at the time wanted to clean up the city. He wanted to gentrify the East Side. And they started to evict squatters and to tear down buildings that the punks and their compatriots were living in. And this manifests with them being forced out of their buildings, living in Tompkins Square. And the police come in 1988. And what's really telling is that they cover their badges and remove their name tags before they go into the park. And what happens is they start beating the people in the park, not moving them from them, but beating them. And the removal of the name tags, the covering of the badges tells us that this was probably the intent all along. And it causes immense backlash. But the Tompkins Square riot is something that definitely sticks in the minds of the punk scene. And 16 years later, they have a concert commemorating it. It's relatively uneventful, but the reality is that they were protesting this gentrification. They were protesting the turning of their neighborhood into something that it was not. And even though they were protesting, they weren't able to stop it. Now, punk uses symbols, not only to antagonize, but to express ideas and concepts. So the one on the right is obviously associated with bad religion, as you can tell by the name bad religion. This is known as the cross buster. And it is a symbol that is there to call attention to their distaste for organized religion and the things attached to it. They're not an atheist band. They're not a satanic band. In fact, there's a number of beliefs and religious holdings within the band. But they are opposed to organized religion and the ideas and concepts that they feel that organized religion puts on people to make them less free or to make them subject to power and authority. On this side, we have the symbol of crest, which is very similar to the bad religion symbol. But it's a combination of a number of them that are seen as symbols of oppression by crests. In there, you have the swastika, the Union Jack, and the cross. They're hard to make out, but they are in there. So these are symbols that are used. Over here, we have the iron front symbol, which is used by a number of different groups in punk. So it's anti-royalist, anti-Nazi, anti-communist. And you can see the band Strike Anywhere uses it fairly regularly in their symbols, as well as various punk bands or associations putting, so we have the Love Hockey, Hate Fascism shirt. Fascism is a frequent target of punk rock in general. I can't tell you how many bands I've seen wearing shirts that have plays on ideas and concepts that attack fascism. For example, I've seen one looks like a that says "fuck Nazis," right? After the 2016 election, I saw a number of shirts that said "make fascists afraid." There's a very clear mentality and ideology at place here. Now, punk has had problems with racism. That is something to keep in mind. that the early days of punk rock, presenting ideas and concepts, had a number of bands that would use symbols just to shock. The Dead Boys, the Sex Pistols in particular, would wear swastikas at times, even though they were not fascist or espousing fascist ideology. And a number of right-wing groups became attracted particularly to the Oi branch of punk that emerges in Britain during the late 70s and early 80s. In fact, we know that a number of far-right parties actually recruited membership from this far-right, from these punks that were becoming skinheads. And in doing so, they were using them as a form of paramilitary enforcer. This, however, looks like something that it's not. So this is a cover of a Reagan Youth album, and they are using their name to say that they are kind of attacking Reagan conservatism and associating it with fascism because of the connotation with Hitler Youth, and dressing in this way because they're asserting that the Reagan administration is clannish in its structure. But here are some skins in Chelsea in 1982. I don't think there's any ambiguity of what's going on here. These skins are Nazi skins. And the reality is that there is a clear divide within the skinhead community that happens in the late 70s, early 80s, where you have these far-right skins that emerge, and you also have the apolitical or left-wing skins at the same time. And the problem is that early on, there's no real way to differentiate this. For example, in an early compilation of Oi bands called Strength Through Oi, which unfortunately is a play on the Nazi slogan Strength Through Joy, that has a picture of a skinhead called Nicky Crane on it. And when they blow up the picture of Nicky Crane to put on the album, they realize he's covered in white power and fascist tattoos. And being so close to the print run, instead of removing the picture and getting a new one, they airbrush out the tattoos. But the skins know who Nicky Crane is. He's not someone they are unaware of. He's quite well known within the scene, within the skinhead community. And he is very much one of these Nazi skinheads. Ironically, Crane is also homosexual. And it's only over time that his homosexuality eventually wins out against him being this Nazi skin. And he breaks away from it, causing various members of the right-wing music community at the time to threaten him with death because of it. So we have reactions against it, right? You have bands like Screwdriver that emerge in the early phases of this that are inherently Nazi in their structure. And they begin to be associated with punks. We have Skins and Punks Against Racism that emerges as an organization. And the punk community decides that the only way to really get rid of the Nazis is to speak to them in languages they understand. Right? So I have some quotes here. One of them is from Deck Allen. He's the singer of Oi Glory. There have been gigs where Nazis have turned up and we've said, we're not playing until these fuckers are out of here. In this instance, we said, we're going to go and talk about this stuff. We went on, and the first songs we did were about fascism and racism. It wasn't going down very well. They hit me, and I hit them with a microphone stick. And it turned into a barroom brawl, like in a Western. Most of the locals sat there and watched as if it was entertainment. The only ones who lifted a finger to help were the Russian bar owners, who came out from behind the bar with blocks of wood and laid into the bones. This is Dave Kaufman. He's a longtime Denver concert promoter, notably of the Warlock Pinchers. That whole movement was a frightening one to have at a show. The last Warlock Pinchers show at the Gothic Theater, they all came in and they were Sieg Heil, and the entire crowd on the main floor just suddenly turned on them. Everyone said, we had enough of this shit. All of a sudden, this phalanx of skinheads came running through the front door and were never seen or heard from again. It was an amazing thing. The crowd just collectively decided, there's 700 of us, and there's 400 of you, and we've had it. They ran with their tied up boots and their gray jackets and their shaved heads, and they ran out of that theater, and I swear to God it ended the problem. The punk scene decided that the best way to deal with the Nazis was to beat them out of the scene. And you can see it manifest in the music of those Nazi bands. It goes from being Oi, punk inspired, to being just generic hard rock. They left the scene. I have a last quote here from Bad Brains, which is a black hardcore band from Washington, D.C. This is Daryl Jennifer is the bassist. I was going to the bathroom before the club opened. I saw a kid and he followed me. When I came out, he said, "Mr. Jennifer, I want you to know I used to be a racist pinhead and an asshole. And ever since I saw your band, I'm different. I have a wife and kids." That alone was my platinum album. Changing life, just by existing. It's what punk rock's all about. A lot of this. It's what the punk subculture is all about. And the punks have kept this up over the years. They have produced a number of anti-racist songs, not even in times of particular racial animus, just in general. I have a list here. Nazi Punks Fuck Off by the Dead Kennedys. No Nazis in Punk by Antidote. Fuck Nazi Sympathy by Osrotten. Anti-Klan Racism Sucks by 7 Seconds. Degradation by Gorilla Biscuits. Bash the Fash, which is Bash the Fascist by Oi Boy. Nazi White Trash by Leftover Crack. Introduction to the Opposites by Kid Dynamite. Avenues and Alleyways by Rancid. Racists by Anti-Flag. So you can see that this progresses. The last song on that list is from 2016. And there have been others since then. It's just the last time I updated the list was 2016. Speaking of 2016, the Riot Girl movement is another element of punk rock that emerges in the 90s. Riot Girl is a branch of feminism within punk. Now, punk starts off with a lot of women involved, but as the bands got famous, as they got popular, the number of women involved declines and it shrinks. And it's in the 90s with bands like Bikini Kill and Heavens to Betsy that we begin to see a resurgence of this idea of feminist punk rock. This is a map of Riot Girl chapters in the world. So this is set up, this was compiled in 2016, and there are, I want to make sure that I have the numbers right in a second, 193 chapters of Riot Girls listed. 45 of them are explicitly stated as being extant, as in still existing. This is compiled by Astria Saparic, and you can locate it on astriasaparic.com. But you can see that there is Riot Girl activity in every place where there's punk rock activity that we know about, right? So clearly very active in North America, Europe. There's one chapter in Turkey, there's one in Israel, Australia, in China, not China, the Philippines. So we can see that it's active. Now, I will say, this doesn't mean that there aren't any Riot Girls anywhere else. These are just places that set up specific chapters to present their ideas and concepts. Now, Riot Girl, as I said, is very much a feminist movement. It is seeking to present women in a very positive light and to present them as equals within the punk rock community. And these bands continue on with newer bands like Pussy Riot from Russia here. You have the Linda Lindas, who are a group of teenage girls from California who got a band together and became famous in 2016 with their song Racist Sexist Boy. And we also have War on Women here. We're also carrying on this Riot Girl tradition. Pussy Riot in particular gets in trouble with Vladimir Putin in 2012. They play a concert in a church that's seen as offensive, and we see the arrest of members, notably Alina Oliokina. She's arrested in 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2022. In 2012, she was arrested, abused, and put in solitary confinement for protesting the abuse leveled against her. And she escapes Russia disguised as a food courier in December of 2022 because she was protesting the Russian Ukraine. So these are women who are not backing down in the face of active persecution, in the face of active political attack. We also see punks critiquing punk culture. I think this is a really interesting place to look because, as I said, the punks will criticize and critique everything, including themselves. So they have a number of songs that attack elements of the punk community. NoFX put out "It's My Job to Keep Punk Rock Elite," which is an attack on the zine Maximum Rock and Roll. Propaganda put out the song "Back to the Motor League," which is all about shots at the punk scene. And this album in particular is an active protest against fans that they saw showing up at their first shows for their first album. The lead singer, Chris Hanna, said, "When How to Clean Everything came out, we had no idea anyone would like it. Then we went and played some shows, and all of a sudden, oh, who are all these fucking jocks and skaters and surfers here? Fuck them. Let's draw a line in the sand. Let's make sure we're not misunderstood. We have these values. Let's make sure nobody misunderstands them, even if it separates the wheat from the chaff, and we're the chaff. It's just us. Let's lay it out on the table. So we can see here that they have animal-friendly, anti-fascist, gay positive, and pro-feminist on the album. And I'm going to be honest with you, lyrically, the album is not holding it with that guy. This band is letting you know exactly what they think, and if you don't like it, they don't care. They really don't. In the 2016 election, excuse me, this one's the 2000 election, we see the election of President Bush without winning the popular vote and instead only winning the Electoral College, and the punk community railed against this. You can see here, the only Bush I trust is my own, referring to pubic hair, right? And fuck Bush with the anti-swastika sign. Fat Records put out the Not My President symbol shirt that was sold quite frequently. I'm sure that if you were involved in alternative music at the turn of the millennia, you saw the shirt regularly. And the reality is that the punk community will do this. We see it again in 2016 when Donald Trump again wins the presidency by winning the Electoral College, but not the popular vote, right? This is something that maintains throughout. We see a number of songs that react against this. In particular, you see the Descendants, who are not necessarily known for being a political punk band, putting out a song called Who We Are, which is directly in response to the election of Trump in 2016. The band Bad Cop puts out a fairly straightforward feminist rant against the Trump administration. Bands like Anti-Flag put out American Fall. There is a lot of reaction to this. Whenever something like this happens, the punk community does not stay silent, they react to it. They engage with it. And part of this is because they do their own marketing and their own production. Punk, for a long time, has realized that if they want to do something, they have to do it themselves. They can't rely on large companies or record labels. So if you're in a punk band, particularly starting in the 80s, you make your own record label and put out your album. And a number of the biggest labels in punk this day started out in people's garages. Epitaph Records was the brainchild of Brett Gurewitz from Bad Religion. SST was the label that did Kennedy stole. No, excuse me, they did Alternative Tentacles. SST is down south with can't remember right now off the top of my head, that's fine. Discord comes out of Washington, DC from Minor Threat. These bands are all putting together labels, putting out their own albums because no one else will. And because of this, they are able to maintain their presence, even when they are not seen as acceptable, right? They are not part of the zeitgeist. They are not part of the popular music community. Now, we also see that punk rock is not just something that you can be easily. In a number of countries, particularly in Indonesia, punks are sent to rehabilitation camps or re-education camps because they are seen as violating Islamic law. As you can see here, the Indonesian punk band Marginal, who puts out albums that deal with things like imperialism in Indonesia. They have one video where the lead singer is sitting at a desk in a trash dump that's filled with American and Western trash, eating McDonald's. The symbol is very potent here. But they get together with local punk scenes, and symbolically, they are giving this young man a mohawk to demonstrate his standing up against the structures and powers that be in Indonesia. These are not people that are able to go out and just maybe get made fun of. They are actively at threat of arrest in their home country, but they are maintaining their scene and their subculture. Now, the reality is that punk has a lot of very striking fashions, and we see it appropriated by a number of groups and peoples. So I've put up a couple pictures here to show a juxtaposition. In the top left, we have the Casualties. We're a New York-based street punk band. You can tell they're a street punk band because they have mohawks, studded leather jackets. And the thing that I want you to notice is how worn this clothing is, right? They are wearing this every day. This is not a costume. This is who they are. This is what they wear on a regular basis. And down here, we have a K-pop band who's wearing jackets designed to look like the stuff they're wearing. And it's referencing bands that are referenced on their clothing. We have the Exploited, Anti-Nowhere, Oxymoron, Subhumans, The Addicts, GBH. These are all bands that street punks love. And I can't tell you if that band listens to street punk or not. They might. But they don't really look like it, even though they're wearing the uniform, right? The thing is that they will take things from punk and try to make money off it. So on the left, we have Minor Threat's album cover. It's one of the most iconic album covers in all of punk. It's something that every punk does. And on the right, Nike decided to have a skateboarding exhibition they called Major Threat. Guess who got sued? Nike did. They said, oh, we were just trying to pay homage to it. No, you're stealing it, right? Here we have another example. We have the Rockabilly Barbie and the Horror Pops. And the lead singer of the Horror Pops, Patricia Day, they're a Swedish psychobilly band, which is a genre of punk that plays rockabilly instead of bass. She sued Mattel over likeness infringement. I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you think that Mattel was trying to take her image?
It's strange.
It looks like it, doesn't it? The reality is that the court that the case was brought to didn't have jurisdiction over it, so the case was thrown out. But we can see that it's got a lot of similarities attached to it. Here we can see some other examples. Unfortunately, could you move the other camera up for a second? Because I don't want Chris Brown left out of this. So we can see here, and go back to it. All right, so another K-pop band. This one, I think it's called To Anyone, and this young woman is walking up with a bat to give her the sense of like rebellion and dangerousness. The giant Misfits Crimson Ghost skull on her back. The reality is, the Misfits don't actually own that image. They stole it from a 1930s movie serial. But you know who it is, right? And over here we have Chris Brown wearing a Crass sweatshirt. Now, I don't know if he's into anarchic British crusty punk. He might be, but I don't think so. I don't think so. We have another K-pop band here. This one in a direct Misfit shirt. Avril Lavigne, very famously using punk style to get famous in the early 2000s. Once in an interview claiming she invented punk, which was shocking, to say the least. At first, I thought that I was misremembering that, and then I hunted it down, and she didn't think. And then here we have PunKAF with their punk summer ad. Buy your Ramones or Pretenders t-shirt and wear it. I guarantee you're paying more for it than you would pay to go see those bands. So you can see that whenever you want to get some kind of a rebellious identity or attitude, rip off the punks. It's easy to do. And you see it frequently. Kids wearing Ramones shirts, not listening to the Ramones. Kids walking around with Thrasher hoodies, but don't read Thrasher magazine or even know that it's about skateboarding. These are all elements of punk culture that get appropriated. This one's a really good example. This was the New York hardcore symbol. It's also used for straight edge hardcore. How many of you have seen shirts using this iconography, but not related to punk? The first time I saw it, I got real excited. Went to go talk to someone about straight edge. They were not into straight edge. They were like talking about some lake with the drinks. It was a very awkward conversation for both of us. You see it in film and television quite frequently. Granted, this is from a cyberpunk movie, which I will talk about cyberpunk in a moment. It's related to these things. But here you get Suburbia, which was released in 1983. This is actually a pretty good representation of punk. It shows them as a community coming together to protect and to essentially hold together vulnerable people. Less so is class of 1984. These guys look like comic book villains. And I'm going to be honest with you, if you read any comics from the 80s or 90s, and there are punks in it, they're bad guys. Every time. A good example of this would be Bebop and Rocksteady from the Ninja Turtles. They are punks, described as punks, and one of them has a mohawk. In Stranger Things, season 2, you get a group of punks taking an 11, but it shows that kind of acceptance and taking in of people who have been relegated to the outside of society, right? And then this is a particularly dark example. So there's a show called The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina that was on Netflix. This is supposed to be a metal band. I would like to point that out. However, when you look at them, they are clearly not a metal band. They are designed to look like a punk band. They are there to represent rebellion and danger. Their name is Satanic Panic, which is kind of hilarious when you consider the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s. Although particularly egregiously, if you're going to have them look like punks, they're wearing their own band shirt. You're not even supposed to wear the shirt of the band that you're going to see in a concert, let alone your own band. So, punk is a lot of things. It is a critique, it is an assault. In a lot of ways, I view them as the philosophers. They are there as thinkers and critics. They're not there to make you happy, they're not there to make you comfortable, they're there to question what you believe and to make you uncomfortable in that questioning until you can sufficiently answer. So, do you have any questions for me?
At the beginning, you said that you wanted to revive the live music scene. What was happening at the time that they needed to revive live music?
All right, so what was happening in New York at the time was that you would just have bands come in and playing popular songs in bars. And the live music scene was just covers. And for Hilly Crystal, the guy who ran CBGB's, that was just not acceptable, right? He wanted live music that was original. The only problem is that the people making live original music weren't the bands he wanted. But since he wanted original music, that's what he did. He just brought him in. And they all adore him because. Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Me? Me? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. That was fantastic, by the way. I really learned a lot. Thank you. That was really good. So last night I actually went and saw Pussy Riot. They came and performed in Chicago, and they were fantastic and everything. In fact, my son has the straight edge symbol on his hand to show that he was there. But I was wondering if you could maybe in your talk, you talked about women in Riot Grrrl starting at that point. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the women that were important in punk music prior to that, particularly Patti Smith or any others that you?
Right. So, like that first batch of punk bands included groups like Blondie, right? And Debbie Harry is kind of held up as the symbol of punk fashion in a lot of ways. I mean, you could definitely argue that Blondie doesn't make punk music, but they were associated with it. Patti Smith, commonly referred to as the poet laureate of punk rock, she did a lot of really artistic, poetic music and poetry in particular. And she was a driving force in the CBGB's. In fact, she was there at the closing shows of CBGB's before it turned into a Patagonia. She was one of the artists who performed there. After that, you have groups like the Slits in the UK who do a lot of really interesting things. The lead singer of the Slits did a documentary about them later on. I mean, granted, it turned into a bit of an ego piece by the end of it, but it really demonstrated their impact on punk. There's also X-Ray Specs, who most famous song that they have was "Oh Bondage Up Yours," which wasn't even on their album, but it's a really great example of attacking patriarchal power structures within the music industry, because "Oh Bondage" is not about bondage, right? It's about women being held down. There's Wendy O and the Plasmatics. You also have, like, prior to that, Susie Sue and the Banshees. They're a big scene, big in the 80s scene. They eventually do go kind of become goth bands later on. There's like 7 others that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. I'm sorry. Any other questions for me?
You also were talking about the Indonesian punk bands.
Yeah.
Their imposition to American imperialism.
Yeah.
Was there any, I guess, not necessarily collaboration, but work with American punk bands to create a broader message?
So I will say that the punk bands work across the globe, right? They will make sure that they like well-known bands will make sure that they bring lesser-known bands on tour with them quite frequently. Marginal will play with bigger bands from the Western countries when they come through Asia. And then they use that money to actually open like art collectives in places like Chicago, right? So they use that to kind of leverage the benefits of it. A good example of this is that you have a band, Green Day is going on tour very soon. And they're a band that has been in and out of the punk scene based on album, really. And on this latest tour, in the United States, they're going with Rancid, who's a big punk band, but they're also bringing the Linda Lindas with them, right? And then when they play in the UK, they're playing with the Interrupters, who's relatively big, but also Made of Ace, which is essentially a British street punk band made up exclusively of sisters. I'm really interested in what having that household was like in the team. I think it was probably pretty awesome, but it could also be horrifying at the same time, because I don't know if I'd want to live with 4 street punks. No, I know I don't want to live with 4 street punks. Other questions? All right, well, oh, great, yeah.
Do you have a personally favorite variety of punk music that you sort of like attribute, like if you had to identify with an aspect of punk, which would it be and what about that is attractive to you?
So it depends on when you're asking this question, right? I cycle through the kind of subgenres quite regularly. Like in October, I'm listening to a lot of horror punk, which is things like the Misfits, which are bringing in elements of like B horror movies, things like that. I love skate punk, which was really popular when I was growing up. So bands like Bad Religion, Pennywise, No Use for a Name, Millencolin. But at the same time, I also love hardcore. Minor Threat has had a huge impact on my life. I've been straight edge since I was 16, right? I'm 40 now, so we're talking about a sizable portion of my life that has been impacted by that band. Also, like Riot Girl's phenomenal. I have a 6-year-old daughter who loves Riot Girl. Like she will listen to Second Wave Goodbye by War on Women in her room. And that's a song that's dealing with what War on Women views the excesses of second wave feminism, right? So it depends. Like also there are times when it's ska punk, right? Like I want to listen to ska punk a lot. Again, with my daughter, we'll have dance parties to the Suicide Machines in our front room at home. So there are times, like if you ask me then, like Suicide Machines, hands down, right? But you ask me 5 minutes later, Bad Religion, hands down. Because they just appeal to me academically. They get footnotes in the song, right? Like they're great band. So does that answer your question?
Could you use forgot what I was gonna say. Could you use how like society views punk during like different periods as a good litmus test on how like willing a society is to self-reflect and self-understand?
I don't think so. For a good reason. Because when punk first emerges, they're afraid of it, right? They're scared. Like if you watch any like 80s murder dramas like Quincy, they have an episode with a punk band in it at some point. It's like, and they're talking about how this music's about death. Some of it is, right? But not all of it. Whereas later on, it gets commoditized, right? So there's a really good example of this. When the Spice Girls get big, they start using the phrase girl power, which was actually the name of Bikini Kill's fans. And a lot of those original Riot Girl bands saw that as a commodification of who they were and what they believed. And even though you have this like punk's okay image, the reality is that society's still not comfortable. Like they may say, oh yeah, no, mohawks are fine. But if you start questioning the like kind of neoliberal structure of society, that tolerance disappears almost. Yeah.
So a big aspect of punk is identification, and in the 80s we see this especially with the rise of lace code.
Say that again?
Lace code.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you think helped bring about this rise and fall of lace code? Because lace code is not fallen anymore. People like to pretend it is, but it's not the 80s anymore.
So in terms of the skins, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. From what I've researched, and I was doing some deep dives into it for a while, like I was sitting there going, oh God, this is only going to be about skinheads. The reality is that those lace coats didn't really even exist at the time, right? There was this idea that was put forward, like you gotta wear these laces, and that shows you have the Nazi skin or a non-racist skin. But when you actually go and like ask people that were skinheads at the time if they were engaging in lace code, they didn't. So it's, and I mean, I heard this growing up too, right? Like from other like elements of the verbal history of the scene. It's like, yeah, look for red laces or white laces, you know, like that lets you know if you're fun. But the reality is that the vast majority of the laces were always black. So.
Question from online.
Sure.
So you mentioned how this music has had an impact on you and your daughter's life. How would you describe how it impacted you?
It's definitely a point of bonding for us. In a lot of ways, it's who we are as a father and daughter. I share this with her because I love it, and I think she loves it because I share it with her. And I want her to internalize the messages of punk rock, right? Always be yourself. Stand up for what you think is right. Oppose injustice in the world, and don't let other people define you by their terms. So I think in that way, it's me trying to give her tools that she's going to need to succeed in life, but at the same time, doing it by sharing something that deeply bothers. There was another question. Yeah.
Say you were 40.
Yes.
I saw the Ramones with Bad Company in 1981. But I didn't understand they were just the opening band.
Right.
They got bigger all the way through the late 80s. Then I don't remember much more. The 70s days were a blur. Because when you went to a concert, there was a lot of smoke in here.
Yeah,
no matter where you went or what concert you went.
Yeah, I will say the interesting thing is in the 80s, the punk scene really kind of evolved in two ways about that, right? Because you do have the emergence of straight edge. And I will say in concerts that I've been to, punk ones are usually the ones I see the least drug use, actually. Primarily because you're always gonna have a subset of the crowd that is straight edge. And in terms of the Ramones, they did get bigger through the 80s, but they never achieved the popularity they really wanted to. And in the end, they embraced being a punk.
I can remember when the Sex Pistols were a big thing, but they were in England, so
yeah,
it's not like I went over to England to see a concert.
Yeah. And
I was just learning how to drive.
Yeah. I think one of the things too is that if you do get huge as a punk band, there becomes an immediate distrust of you as a punk band from the punk community after that. Like if you get huge, but you've stayed on your label and you're still espousing the same ideas, you're usually fine, right? But if you get big and you've signed to a major and your songs start to sound different, then they don't want anything to do with you. And a lot of bands do try to overcome this. For example, I know Green Day in particular use their money, and they have a lot of it at this point, to save 924 Gilman Street in Oakland, which is the small punk club that was in Oakland that bands like Operation Ivy played at, that are huge deals to the punk scene. Like if you liked Operation Ivy or Dancehall Crashers, any of those bands, that was a big deal. They were there. And saving 924 Gilman as Berkeley gentrified was kind of Green Day's way of going, hey, this is still who we are. We may be a big popular band, but Operation Ivy is probably the biggest influence on them, right? Other questions? Yeah.
You were talking about how like if you did certain things or your sound changed, people would disregard you. Do you think that applies to like the Clash and how they were kind of like accosted by like Crass and stuff like that?
So the interesting thing is that yeah, Crass went after the Clash for their popularity, but the punk scene as a whole, like the Clash are probably as close as you get to Saint, right? Like no one really has anything bad to say about them, particularly because the band did make music on their own terms, right? Like if you listen to Sandinista, that is a band that does not care if you like that album, right? They're doing it because that's who they want to be. That's the music they want to make. And if you're a punk rock purist, you might get upset by that, right? But musically, it's less important than the ethos. So the Clash stick it out. It's like Refused with their album The Shape of Punk to Come. It brings in elements of classical music. There's like a violin on Tannhauser. They bring in elements of like European dance electronica. And the reality is they're challenging. They're saying, we are gonna make music that is punk and is not gonna sound punk. And you have to deal with that. And that album is considered a classic as well. So if you're changing music, but you're doing it to challenge other punks, you're probably gonna be fun. Right, other questions?
I was gonna ask, because you mentioned the Descendants and how they're not normally considered like a political punk band, so what kind of punk band would you classify as?
So they dealt with a lot of like social issues with growing up, right? They started out as teenagers, and you get like your typical teenager songs that are dealing with, like being an outsider. One of their songs is called Mass Nerder, and it's essentially about being a nerd in school. And like he says, I'm gonna kick their asses in class. I can read you under the table, right? It's all about embracing his academic prowess. I mean, the lead singer goes off to college. They have an album called Milo Goes to College. And he gets his PhD in chemistry, right? And there's songs about him dealing with the rigors of academia, the time for a new me. So they do deal with things. They don't get explicitly political a lot, like American is a good example and Who We Are. But their most famous songs are dealing with just the realities of being an outsider. What are the questions?
Yeah, maybe it's just because it's a bit smaller. Do you have any pins in, like the Chicago scene, like you could break out a Big Black or anything?
Yeah, I do. The Chicago scene is interesting because it goes in so many different directions, right? Like you have bands like Big Black that are almost industrial in their musical stylings. And then Naked Ray Gun, Screeching Weasel, who kind of fall into like the Ramones core of it, where they sound like Ramones bands. And then you get bands that just explode out of it, like Rise Against, right? Like I remember going to see the record release show for Revolutions Per Minute at the Fireside Bowl, which is a bowling alley in Chicago. Buying the record from the lead singer, working their own merch booth. And within 2 albums, they had exploded and were like doing major tours. The reality is Chicago's a great music town. And it's always had this background in different musical genres. And the punk scene in Chicago is vibrant, it's active, and it's willing to tolerate a fairly wide range of punk genres. So in a lot of ways, I'm surprised more bands haven't come out of Chicago. But I think it's because of that diversity that we don't get like a honing up, right? Like New York, hardcore was it. And you get great hardcore bands out of New York. LA, skate punk, you get great skate punk bands. You get great bands out of Chicago, but they're not defining a genre. Any other questions? Did I hit my time limit?
We've got a couple of minutes tonight, anything else is a question? But we're coming to close tonight.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, let's say. I'm super from Westville, it's good to see you all. If you haven't had a chance to sign in with something, the sign-in sheet, please do so before you head out. But thank you, have a good day.